Ed, I was saying earlier on that obviously the tariffs aimed at Canada and Mexico have been at least paused for a month, but that's not the case with the ones heading to China.
No, I mean, technically, and, there's a whole small print conversation here, but technically those are already in place. So they're in place as of the morning of the 4th of February. But there is a massive proviso to that, which is that if there's anything that was put onto a ship in Beijing or Shanghai or wherever it is, before the 1st of February, then that doesn't pay any tariffs. And actually, that means most of the ships right now that are coming in towards LA or wherever it is, Long Beach, they're not going to pay a single cent of tariffs because they were loaded much earlier than that. And actually, it won't be until maybe the 16th of February, perhaps, that you actually start to see the tariffs coming in, which gets to this kind of broader issue, which is like, China has just retaliated, or at least they've said they're going to retaliate. So there's going to be tariffs on liquefied natural gas, on coal, and a few other things as well as some court cases they're going to bring with the WTO. But a lot of those tariffs, they don't actually kick in until next week.
So this is a slow motion thing, really.
Yeah, and we're in this kind of grey area at the moment. And there are definitely... I've been kind of, spending the day looking through the spreadsheet. What are the kinds of things that come in by air to America from China, which are the things that would potentially, pay some tariffs? And actually, there's quite a lot of electronics that come in and important parts for nuclear kind of reactors. So important stuff. But most stuff doesn't pay the tariffs. And I think that gets to this bigger thing, which is, to what extent is this just a negotiating ploy to get some sort of a concession from China? And that's the way it manifested with Canada and with Mexico. And you kind of expect that probably it would manifest that way with China, just because all of these, if you look at the executive orders from the White House, all of these have been headlined being about opioids and being about kind of fentanyl and how to prevent this stuff.
Yeah, that seems to me to be the big difference when it comes to Mexico, when it comes to Canada. Trump has very clear, relatively simple domestic asks. But with China, he seems to think that there is a great existential global struggle going on. And so in a sense, it's harder to see what smaller concessions the Chinese could give him that he would then declare a great win.
Well, I mean, no, I totally agree. He hates the deficit. I mean, that's the overarching issue, the kind of psyche analysis of Donald Trump. He hates deficits. He hates the fact that the US is reliant on getting imports from China, and that's, at the top of the list. But also Europe and indeed Canada and Mexico. But what's interesting, and so I think there is this kind of long-term conversation which he and a lot of people within his administration, like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who we've basically heard nothing from so far. The Finance Minister of America has been non-existent in this. But he is interested in, okay, look at the world. And this is something that's relevant to us as well. Look at the world. Why does China have this enormous surplus? Why is it that no other country in the world is able to manufacture and to, create industries? Because China is crowding out everything. That's like an interesting, chewy economic question, actually, that most people would kind of be behind. But it does seem like if you look at the specific executive order, even on China, it does talk about opioids. So I wonder whether this is the initial salvo and then we get that deeper discussion later on.
And that's because although fentanyl is no longer sent from China to America, some of the chemical components to make fentanyl are sent to Mexico and South America and become fentanyl in America.
Exactly.
So there is an issue there.
And you could see how maybe President Xi, and their call that supposedly is going to come soon, maybe he would say something like, we're going to have a task force as well about those components, which is exactly, I mean, I don't think it was that much of a concession that he got from the Mexico and from Canada to try and prevent this extraordinary, cataclysmic trade battle. But maybe that'll be the playbook. But with Donald Trump, how do you know? We're back in this kind of 4 years of uncertainty.
We certainly are. Back in the 1970s, there was a similar kind of argument about Japan. Japan was destroying the American car industry by selling so many cheap cars and motorbikes and the rest of it. And in those days, tariffs and so forth were used in ways which persuaded Japanese companies to relocate and build their factories in America, where they still are.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent you think there is a bigger plan here by the Trump administration to try and force Chinese manufacturers to locate in America.
I think it's hard to make out how much actual strategy there is here. I think those are definitely conversations that are happening in the Treasury Department and in Commerce as well. And I think I suspect by the end of these 4 years, probably there will be Chinese manufacturers putting factories in China and relocating. It feels logical, and the same thing with Europe as well, because like you say, that's what happened in the 1970s. And if you're looking for a kind of archetype, who was Donald Trump most like as his predecessors? Well, it's very hard to find a perfect archetype. But actually, Richard Nixon was also very kind of anti-globalism, globalization. He was very
bring the jobs back home.
Yeah, and he raised tariffs on a lot of countries as well. So it might well be that we see some of that. But China's much bigger than Japan, so that's the difference.
Of course, very much so. Now, the simple question, in a sense, which people at home will be very interested in, is how much would this damage us if this goes to a full-scale trade war? Big if, between China and America, the world's two largest economies. How badly hit would Britain be, and how?
It's really hard to calculate precisely. I mean, the standard answer that everyone will give you is that the UK is an open trading economy, and so anything that's happening around the world will affect us, and that's usually the case. So if you see inflation in China and all of this stuff about tariffs, about trade, ultimately it seems to add up to more inflation, because you're taking something that's made cheaply in one part of the world and you're throwing kind of sand into the wheels of commerce, and either someone has to build a factory in America, which is more expensive, or it just gets more expensive to take stuff across the Pacific. So that all spells inflation.
I can see how it would hit the Americans with inflation, but why should that hit us?
Well, just because it's that whole thing. We import most of our stuff from overseas. If the marginal extra cost of making something is more expensive,
then goes up, and we pay more for it too.
Hit by it. Yeah. However, but that being said, I think it is a good question, because in some ways you could look at the situation we're in at the moment and say we have an unusual opportunity here, which we didn't have before Brexit happened, which is that we have our own kind of trade policy. We're not going to be, because I think the next thing that will happen, the next shoe to drop, is the EU. And I suspect that Donald Trump pretty soon will say, listen, we're putting tariffs on Europe. And that's going to be really tough for Europe, because how does Europe respond? Who speaks for Europe? And you need to speak quickly to try and respond to Donald Trump. But the UK is not in that. And so, and I think that the other advantage, even more so than Brexit, is we just don't make much stuff anymore.
Well, I was going to ask about that. We have a sort of post-Brexit agility on this stuff, but at the same time, I think in goods at any rate, we run a deficit with the Americans.
Yeah, it's broadly, I mean, it's balanced. It depends on whose numbers you're looking at, but basically there's this kind of, you can look at the chart of who has deficits with America, which is what Donald Trump is kind of looking at. He's going, right, EU, China, Canada, all of these countries, Mexico, and he's saying, we'll tariff you, we'll tariff you, we'll tariff you. The UK is nowhere on that list. Basically, it has either a surplus or it's kind of close to zero with the US.
And we are, of course, and rightly, obsessed by growth in this country at the moment. Does this period, when we're not maybe facing the tariffs that many of our competitors are facing, does that give us an opportunity to grow a bit faster? Does it attract a bit more international investment to the UK?
Well, you've got the conventional economist responses, which is like, in a chaotic world where value is being destroyed, that's not good for anyone. But I think there is an interesting alternative, more interesting response, which is to say it might comparatively be an advantage for the UK, because we could be this bridge, and we could be a conduit for European goods or European components that then get manufactured in the UK and sent over to the US. And I know that people within the US administration are saying that they think they can get a trade deal with the UK in a matter of months. This is what people within the White House are actually saying. Whether that's true or not.
Well, if it was true, it would be much more important to us, perhaps, than the marginal changes that Keir Starmer's trying to get with the EU.
Potentially, yeah. And it would be an enormous deal. There's lots of talk about this and lots of salesmanship, but, we'll have to see.
I do love a silver lining. Ed Conway, thank you very much indeed.